Hello. All right, so get your names down and we will begin our final. Now, what I want to do is I don't want to go, 1 through 35 and tell you, okay, this is the option you want to choose. This is college. I don't want to go that far. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at like a couple numbers at a time, and I'm going to give you key information that you need to be aware of, that you need to recall from your assignments, so that you can get it right. So I will drop heavy hints, if you will, okay? And I feel like that should be fair, considered fair. And so you'll definitely, I would think, still benefit from being here today, in addition to the extra credit points you're getting. All right. So any last minute questions or comments as we're getting into the end of the year?
You, Mr. C. Well, I'm still behind. I apologize that I can't keep up with this topic. It is so dynamic and I don't even think I'm answering it right. Did you try to meet me for a Zoom yesterday too? Or no?
No,
That's
my
the
wi-
announcement for today.
yeah, my wife sets up the Zoom meetings for me, to be honest. And yeah, so she should have set up today's Zoom yesterday, but
Okay.
that's all that
I
happened
thought
on
I missed a
my end was
meeting.
that.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so yeah, no sweat. So yeah, if you received something yesterday, it should have been an invitation to today's. Yeah, anything beyond that, I'm not aware of. But it's a little late now, but of course I do offer that. I did that with one student from another school who was requesting extra help, and I would have an extra every now and then, an extra Zoom meeting with her. So
I just have two missing assignments that I've been working on.
sure,
That's my story.
it's okay. And so, like I said, I reserve the right to make exceptions with students that I know are working through it and so forth. And so, I think if you look at your scores, I did I engaged in a compromise with you. Oftentimes, I didn't give you full credit, but I didn't take off 10 either, because I knew that I trusted that you weren't just slacking, that you're working away. So I took a few points off. But oftentimes in your case, Melissa, it was offset by continually attending these meetings. And so then that would be offset by 5 extra credit points. On the Constitution, if you may notice, I actually gave you guys 10 because I blabbed on for like 2 hours. And so, yeah, it heavily pays to come to these meetings, in my estimation. And I'm glad to have you. I have a new Letitia. I need to make sure I get your name down. But yeah, just chug away, Melissa. And if you would, just make sure that you've turned in everything by the 14th, okay? Canvas at midnight of the 14th of that Saturday, it's not even up to me. Canvas will not accept anything after that, okay? So be sure that you do, and you're doing fine. Look at your scores. I think you're more accurate in your analysis of the section's thesis than you're giving yourself credit for. You're doing pretty well. All right. So anybody else before we dive into the final? I absolutely will, Susanna. Yeah, so I will post test 3 video onto Canvas as soon as I can, okay? Absolutely. All right, so let's dive into it, if you will. All right. So Jackson's time period, right? To me, it's a classic case of selection, organization, and presentation of facts can be very subjective as far as what facts you conveniently pick to put into your history writing and which facts you conveniently omit. So in this case, I think this is a case in point. With Jacksonian America, when you compare the late 1820s and the 1830s to the prior generation, yes, you could make the argument that our republic, because we have a republic, right, was a bit democratized relative to the previous generation of the founding fathers. So for instance, right, the franchise, who citizenship is entitled to. The founding fathers kind of dropped the ball as far as issuing universal citizenship. And so they allowed each state to decide, and each state was rather stringent with whom they would allow to be a citizen. And oftentimes it was just property owning white English men, men of English stock. And so that was a limit to how enlightened the state's new constitutions became during the War for Independence. So at any rate, at the time of the 1820s and going into the 1830s, many states, the majority, I dare say, democratized their franchise. They opened it up to non-property owning white men. And of course, by today's standards, that's not very impressive. But it included a demographic of poor white men that had previously been disenfranchised prior to this. So that did happen. The electoral college system was not abolished, obviously. We still have it. Presidential electors began to be directly elected during this time period. There was an increase in political participation. You look at the presidential races, look at the back of Alan Brinkley's textbook, and it's relatively impressive. You have, look at the difference between 1820 to 1828. The percentage of eligible voters going to the polls to vote, even by today's standards, it was pretty impressive. And a lot of them engaged in pageantry of sorts. They had rallies, parades, even voting day was a rather, kind of a civically engaged institution and practice for Americans, of which they were proud. And so all of that did happen. And then nomination, they started the party convention system, and that is true, where technically now, Joe Bob from Kentucky can run for office. If he goes to the local party convention and is nominated and wins by popular vote in that convention. And so at any rate, that was democratized as well. However, right, people would contend that there was a lot of populism that happened. And to me, populism, you could take it as a good thing and you could take it as a negative thing. But in this case, I mean it in the negative way, okay, for the test and on this subject. And by the way, so many of these answers are found in the argumentative assignments. I can't highlight that enough. Mireya, go ahead, hon.
Sorry, I have a question.
Don't be sorry.
For number one, it's asking which one is not true during Jackson's era, right?
Right.
Or
right. So yeah, please don't
Okay.
get confused by those. Absolutely, I try to emphasize the not and capitalizing it. So yeah, you're ironically looking for the wrong answer. You're absolutely right, Mireya. And so yeah, please keep that in mind.
Thank you.
No problem. Same thing with number 8, which of the following is false concerning the Trail of Tears. So you're ironically looking for the wrong answer on those questions. So absolutely, that's great that you gave everybody a heads up on that. I certainly don't intend to confuse anyone. Okay, but going back to populism, to the positive extent, you could contend that when the institutions, particularly governmental institutions, are not reflective of the will of the people and are not engaged in civic virtue and putting what's best for the majority of people, in all demographics in mind when they make policy, You could have an angry populist movement that kind of bypasses those institutions and says, we the people are making demands, right? I think of the Pauline Myers thesis about the Constitution, when the founding fathers were pretty conservative and they didn't really want to put much enlightened into the Constitution, and they were given popular pressure, populist pressure to do so. So that's the positive light, right? But to me, the negative light of populism is when you appeal to the lowest common denominators, when you appeal to kind of like the term a demagogue, when you are a manipulator of the people, you'll do anything to get their votes, and you appeal to their base instincts. If they want credit, if they want land, if they want money, if they want access to this or to that, if they ostracize a certain demographic as the other, right, as the outside demographic, and they want to discriminate against them, you acquiesce to it, you give into it, you go along with that, and engage in scapegoat type policies. And so to me, that's the type of populism, the negative facet of it, that I intend to convey in this assignment and on this final. So some people contend that populism, right, is a quid pro quo process whereby the politicians, in return for the votes of their constituents, will appeal to their base sentiments and aspirations. And the key word there is the adjective base, right? And so what better example of that is the Trail of Tears, right? Whereby the people in the Carolinas and Georgia, et cetera, they simply coveted, I mean, it was a little more complex than that, but not much. They simply coveted the Native Americans' land, and they wanted it. And so the state legislative body assemblymen would say, well, we're going to engage in, an eminent domain law, and we're going to force the Cherokee and other tribes to sell their lands to the state for the common good, and we're going to offer it to our common white citizens. So to me, that's an example of the negative facet of populism. And I feel as if, and I wrote as if in the assignment, that was the case, that type of negative populism occurring during the age of Andrew Jackson. And people like Alexa de Tocqueville, right? He did not give unequivocal praise for this democratization that he saw in American culture and institutions. It concerned him in his famous book, Democracy in America. He thought that it was excessive. He thought it was dangerous toward minority groups, etc. And he was particularly concerned that judge positions were increasingly elected, because they would then feel pressure to appeal to making popular decisions instead of the right decisions and protecting the minority groups, etc. And so that's important to keep in mind. And at this time period, remember, they had the term log cabin campaign in your textbook, as well as in that argumentative handout on Andrew Jackson's time period, is that politicians like Andrew Jackson, Richard Hofstadter, an historian, said that offices fell to people like Andrew Jackson like ripe fruit falling from a tree right into his hand. He was of the Scots-Irish demographic. He was from the frontier region of Tennessee. He had a frontier-like disposition as far as a hot temper, kind of intolerant, temperamental, claimed to be a self-made man, coming from poverty into wealth, for rugged individualism, right? Against bourgeois factions who were distrusted as parasites and recipients of privilege, right? And then also against Native Americans as dangerous savages. And of course, there's a little bit more complexity to it when you look at Andrew Jackson's biography, for instance, his adopting a Native American child. But then again, you have plenty of evidence of him doing things to dispossess Native Americans of their lands to such an extreme that to this day, there's a strong lobbyist movement to get him off the $20 bill. All right. So, but oftentimes, when you look at going back to de Tocqueville, he contended right off the bat in his book that one thing that did impress him was the relative equality of condition amongst Americans, that he didn't see this gaping gulf between the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor, that he, almost like Aristotle's middle-class society, that you had a society of a lot of subsistence and small-scale cash crop farmers and artisans and skilled workers, etc. And that impressed him, comparing it back to his mother, France. Nevertheless, Edward Pessin and other books that you could look at now, they contend that that is not the case. That when you look at tax returns and other type of official papers and documents, that there was quite a bit of a gulf between the rich and the poor, that there existed an elite, if you will, within the cities and on the frontier. And so, yeah, according to Edward Pessin and others, they heavily challenged that notion that we were a, kind of, a lower middle class society. So then you also have Andrew Jackson, moving on to like number 7. He did contend, he did use that term, that he had a popular mandate in doing some of the things that he did. Most salient to me that pop out are his war against the National Bank, as well as the Trail of Tears with the Native American tribes. He contended that it's the will of the people, it's what they wanted. And like the Spanish mandato, right? That means like a command, that the people were mandating it. They were commanding that credit be more easily and more widely dispersed and available, rather than through a bank, one central bank of the United States, established in New York. And so he broke up the bank. He established, or he didn't establish, but he promoted the establishment of wildcat state banks, whereby access to credit did become a little bit more broadly accessible. And then with the Trail of Tears, again, he contended that it was a mandate from the people, that that's what they wanted, was that land belonging to the Native Americans by federal treaties. All right. So let's see here. With the Trail of Tears in particular, it did involve a power struggle between the state legislators and the federal government and the tribes, because the federal government, like at the Treaty of Newashota, it granted that land to the Cherokee. And now Georgia and South Carolina are demanding that that land be given back to the state. And so with William Wirt as an attorney, the Cherokee actually won in the Supreme Court decision, them contending that a federal treaty trumps a state legislative law. And so if the federal treaty, like Newashota, grants that land to the natives, then the natives don't have to sell that land to the states. It actually stuck up for the tribes in the name of national supremacy over state laws. And so the eminent domain laws were overturned, if you will, in the Supreme Court. However, Andrew Jackson stepped in and defied that decision, contending that he had a popular mandate, again, from the people, and used paternalistic rhetoric, and contended that it is for the good of the Native Americans, it's for their own good, that they are incapable and, mainly incapable, because they had demonstrated plenty of evidence of desire to assimilate by this time. When you look into the facts, right, as far as schools for their children, adopting the Christian religion, becoming cash crop farmers and artisans, engaging in commerce, learning that, devising their own written language with borrowing the English alphabet, et cetera, et cetera. But he contended that they still were unable to assimilate. And in that they were unable to assimilate, they were incompatible with WASP, kind of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americana, and that in being incompatible, that conflict was inevitable, and that sooner or later they would inevitably be wiped out by the white American demographic. And so therefore he said it's for their own good, it's for their own defense and protection, that he forced them to sell their lands to the states and be removed to Indian territory in present day Oklahoma and Arkansas. All right. So let's see here. Like I said, I can't emphasize enough, almost all of the questions directly derive from the handouts. So by all means, print them out or have them accessible in open windows on your computer and refer to them when you're going through the test. I couldn't stop you from doing an open notes test anyway, but most of the time I'm okay with it anyway, so that's fine. Number 9, the instructor used behavioral data to prove the existence of racism in 19th century America because the press, politicians, and other primary source writers were not foolish enough to admit to such. I would be skeptical of number 9, of its truth. Look in the handout and see if I tried to contend that racism was overt, that it was obvious, that it was unapologetic, that it was found in the written sources in the 1800s, especially against certain demographics like Hispanics. All right, so take a look at that. And Chicano historical perspective, absolutely, they contended that the Anglo settlers were ungrateful, that they capitalized and manipulated easy conditions for them to accept in Spanish or Mexican, Texas, and that Santa Anna's constitution was a convenient excuse or pretext for rebellion. And then on the same time, court American history, right, from what some of us learned as kids, contends the other direction, right? Like with number 11, is that the April 6th law against American immigration, and in particularly Santa Anna's uber conservative constitution, one of 2 that he implemented that undercut representative and local government, that those comprised the reasons, the sparks for the Texas Rebellion. All right, and I love that about history, is both of those could be simultaneously true. All right, and then number 12, the instructor highlights popular blame for the Mexican-American War and Bear Flag Revolt in California, suggesting that the federal government was not in the proverbial driver's seat. That is very subjective. Some people would contend, especially when you look at James K. Polk as the new president in 44, and he made it overtly obvious that he wanted California from Mexico. He pretty obviously provoked a fight over the Texas border dispute, and in trying to diplomatically bully Mexico into selling the land to us of the far west. But nevertheless, was that argument made in the handout? So go back to the handout and see, because if it was brought forth that, that there's popular culpability, that the common people were wanting this and they had their eyes wide open to who they were electing, then that answer would be true. Mireya.
I have a question, kind of pertaining to number 11, I think. But I remember reading about this, and was it Mexico's refusal, like after the settlers didn't want to follow like rules and stuff like that, that they had put in the beginning when they started allowing settlers into
Sure.
like the Mexico region?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, what you're describing to me is basically the April 6th colonization law under President Bustamante of Mexico. That was just it. They were contending that that the Anglo settlers were not abiding by their end of the bargain. After a certain number of years, I don't remember if it was 2 to 5 years, they were no longer to be exempt from paying taxes, and they were to pay taxes, especially in trading with nearby Louisiana, and they were blatantly disregarding that. They were blatantly disregarding Mexico's prohibition of slavery and bringing slaves in illegally. They were not conducting business in Spanish. They were not becoming Roman Catholic and assimilated into the population. They engaged in a couple rebellions, the most famous of which was the Fredonian Revolt. And so absolutely, Mier y Terán came up and did an investigation of the land and said it was time to begin deporting some of these Anglo settlers and cracking down on them, because clearly they were in defiance of what had been asked of them. So yeah, that was all the April 6th law. I mean, there might have been more to it that I don't presently recall, but what you just described, Mireya, to me describes the April 6th law. But remember,
Okay, thank you.
no problem. So remember, no matter how justified the April 6th law was, right, it still is contended in old American court history books as being discriminatory toward Anglo settlers. All right. And so I try to just,
Wait,
yeah, go ahead.
sorry. For number 11, I'm just reading it right now, and I'm a little confused on like what it's asking.
Sure. So number 10,
On
right? It's contrary. I try to balance everything in my class as best as I can. Is number 10 is more in line with the present popular interpretation of Mexico's loss of Texas, is that the Mexican government, the Mexican people were wronged. And the Anglos that came in were defiant, they were ungrateful. They took any and every opportunity they could to try to wrest, to try to take Texas, or at least the eastern portion of Texas, from Mexico, right? And so, but I thought, you know what, I'm going to balance that with just remembering the old court history, which doesn't hold a whole lot of water any longer. But again, I always try to give two divergent views on the same topic, right, as far as interpretation. So number 11 is the old history that's very, because remember, court history, it praises American winners. It's very lopsided. It's very biased. Okay. And so I just want you to be familiar with court history as well. Is no matter how little credibility it holds today in academia. And that's just it, is that number 11 is trying to convey that in old court history accounts, the Anglos were justified in fighting against Mexico and wresting Texas from Mexico because of things like the April 6th colonization law and because of Santa Ana Siete Leyes Constitution. Okay.
thank you.
No problem. Yeah, so I just tried it. Like I said, I always feel like if I do my job, even with a modicum of success, is I don't want you to know nor care where I personally, as your instructor, stand on a lot of these issues. I feel like that's not my job. That constitutes indoctrination. I just want you to be familiar, especially if for those few of you who are going to major in history, I want you to be familiar with, oh, okay, I can identify that. That's old American court history. Oh, okay, I can identify that perspective and that kind of data. That comes from a Chicano history perspective, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so that's what I try to do. And so, so again, look for number 12, look in the handout, okay? Because that's very argumentative as far as how true that is. But if that is the case in the handout, then be sure to put true on that one, all right? And so And then the same thing with 13. You should be able to find 13 right out of the handout. An unhealthy habit and cycle of Americans manufacturing unity by way of stigmatizing a certain nationality or ethnicity as an other and coveting that other group's land and justifying war against that said group. I think you'll find that definitely in the handout. Mireya.
With number 12,
Uh-huh.
I remember reading the handout. It was a little bit ago, but wasn't the handout about talking about how when the settlers went into Mexico, like they were a little bit separate from the government at the time, I guess,
Uh-huh.
and they asked help, but like the actual government didn't provide help, but they didn't tell them no, I guess, right? Is that what
Good.
it's kind of
Good.
saying for the
Absolutely.
driver's seat part of it?
Good, Mireya. Good. Absolutely. So with that information, right, what you just conveyed is that's exactly what I was trying to convey on there, is that I was trying to highlight the guilt of the common people of that generation, and not because otherwise, right, I would have just done kind of great man history, and I would have torn into James K. Polk, Thomas Hart Benton, uh, 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 John C. Fremont, and some of these men in great positions of power. But instead, right, that's just it. I tried to go the popular social history route, history from below, as they call it, and get into the culpable, the blameworthy behavior of the common Americans that were fighting in the Mexican-American War, that were starting the Bear Flag Revolt in California, et cetera, et cetera. So the information you just gave me, Rhea, which is absolutely accurate, what was meant to be conveyed, would demonstrate then, right, that number 12 was meant to be true. Okay. So number 14, Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis argued that superior capital and Anglo-Saxon roots helped determine who won in the West. Take a look again at number 1 in antebellum westward expansion, right? And remember, what he's all about is that the West renewed American meritocracy, equality of opportunity, that there were indiscriminate dangers and opportunities alike, right? So that hence, those who won, according to Frederick Jackson Turner, were those who were the best capable of adapting to these tough, opportunity-laden conditions in the West. Those who were sharp or intelligent, those who were tough and hardy, those who were lucky and had some good fortune. And it didn't matter what their ethnicity was, what their nationality was, what their demographic, their socioeconomic position was, that supposedly it was a free-for-all for everybody. Okay. So then take a look at number 16. Which gold rush data does not seem to support Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis? A temporary lack of institutions and lawlessness in the gold country? Absolutely, that would support it, right? Because after all, he's saying, right, that the conditions in the West were equally tough and dangerous, but filled with opportunities for everybody. So that would support his thesis. Mineral wealth initially extracted with little or no need for capital or expertise? Absolutely, right? Because that would demonstrate equality of opportunity for everyone to be able to get rich if they just got there soon enough. Entrepreneurial opportunities to mine the miners? Absolutely. Seeing a good or service that the miners wanted. And ostensibly, right, you could be pretty poor. You could have been a nobody, in quotes, back in the East. But if you were just sharp enough, right, adaptive enough, you could figure out a need, a demand, and take advantage of it. Foreign miners' taxes against Hispanics and Asians, of course, that would not support his thesis, right? Because he's contending that the West renewed equality of opportunity for everybody. So that if you don't make it in the West, it's your own poor fault, or it's your own poor decisions, or your own weakness, hence your own fault, and nobody else's fault. But he didn't want to concede that certain demographics had to, proverbially put on a backpack filled with rocks as they were trying to run the race and were discriminated against. So D would not support his thesis, even though it's equally true to the other facts. It's inconvenient to Turner's thesis. So against his thesis was section number 2. Those with superior capital eventually arguably won the West, so the rich had a leg up. Those who differ from Turner's opinion. And discrimination faced by demographics, absolutely both of them go against Turner's thesis. And remember, when with Chicano history, right, they're going to emphasize the fact how Hispanics were discriminated against and victimized. And you see that with their land taken from them in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Then, despite the promises of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that they would be treated as citizens entitled to their property, as you may recall, a lot of Hispanics did lose their lands, nevertheless, right? They also contended that many of them experienced what Chicano historians call proletarianization, whereby they were kind of pigeonholed into the proletariat, into the manual laboring echelon of society, doing the grunt work, basically, with few opportunities of making good money and few opportunities of advancement. But what did they do is then Chicano historians don't stop there. Then they want to stress their agency and say, well, they didn't just sit back and take this, right? They say some fought back within the system. I think of like Esteban Ochoa, the mayor of Tucson, Arizona. I think of the Gorras Blancas, the white hats, who ran party members for office in Texas in particular, in New Mexico, and represented Hispanic interests. I think of San Antonio having a middle class there that was successful economically, as well as New Mexico. And some fought outside the system, right? The famous Joaquin Murrieta that created the legend of Zorro, contending that no institutional help was available for Hispanics. So there was nothing left for him to do than to fight and rebel against the Anglo establishment. And that Hispanic people preserved their culture very well. Absolutely. But would Chicano historians contend that Turner's thesis of the West is accurate? That the West opened up and renewed equality of opportunity for everybody, so that it's no one's fault if he or she doesn't make it, doesn't achieve the American dream? Of course not. They would not agree with Turner's thesis. All right, and so moving on to number 19. You will find all of that look and see in the alleged causes of the Civil War handout on number 19. That's part of court history, right? Is that there was an out of the ordinary, anomalous, idealistic generation that was no longer okay with just following tradition and just avoiding the elephant in the room called slavery and other wrongs in society. But they confronted them. They tried to change. They tried to improve their generation, their institutions, their society. So remember, you had the Transcendentalists with their own philosophy. You had the Second Great Awakening with Charles Finney and others, right? Trying to perfect Christians. You had the utopian movements, oftentimes tied to the Transcendental movement, of trying to cultivate the individual to the utmost and do away with societal issues like crime and strife and violence. You had movements against bourgeois conformity, of just living like a robot businessman in this new somewhat industrializing generation. You had reform movements against certain vices that they felt were keeping people in poverty and messing up the nuclear family of mom, dad, and kids. So alcohol, prostitution, etc., domestic abuse. So hence we've also already covered number 20 as well. I just did. Okay. That this was an out of the ordinarily idealistic generation. So you did have prison and asylum reform with an emphasis on rehabilitation. You had a public school campaign, utopian movements aimed to socialize or improve the individual, yes. You had a temperance movement against alcohol, a Sabbath movement to honor Sunday as the Sabbath and not allow work to be done. The abolitionist movement to abolish slavery, obviously. Sharing a fixation with self-control or self-restraint. So all those are true as well. Remember, for 22 and 23, court history contends, right, that the Civil War was triggered by all of this antebellum reform, by all of this antebellum agitation, that they rocked the boat in a good way, right? They forced Americans to have discourse on topics like slavery. And then events transpired in the 1850s that were so polarizing that it helped further push the destined chain of events towards civil war. So you have agitation by reformers. You have polarizing events that made people choose one side or another or feel compelled to do such. And then lastly, in court history, you have the evolution of Abraham Lincoln, who started off by his own contention to be rather indifferent towards slavery, and to, by the time he was killed, almost appearing as if he were an abolitionist martyr. And then the equivalent of the abolitionists, who were uncompromising on slavery, right? Because remember, they didn't care about the Fifth Amendment, stating that all property is to be protected by the federal government, including chattel property or slave property, right? In the courts of law, especially with the Dred Scott case. They didn't care about that. With the moderates, like Lincoln, they said, well, that does matter. So therefore, constitutionally, we can't just take the slaves from the states where it already exists by law, and they're already technically owned by masters. But we could do a couple other things in its stead. to help hasten the eventual demise of slavery. One is they said the Western territories are not states, so we don't have to treat them with states' rights yet. So therefore, we could demand that slavery be abolished and prohibited in all the Western territories before they become states. Because technically the founding fathers had already done that with the Northwest ordinances. They prohibited slavery in the Ohio Valley before the Ohio Valley became the states of Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, etc. Secondly, likewise, we could end slavery in Washington, D.C. because it's its own unique jurisdiction, right? And thirdly, we could offer to the states compensated gradual emancipation, whereby, kind of like eminent domain, we have the people in the states sell their property back to the federal government, and the federal government buys each slave back from their masters. So therefore, they're compensated for their property. And get this, a lot of those in areas that were even willing to contemplate this option, right, in the South, is oftentimes it was on the criterion that those slaves, once they're freed, cannot reside in their state any longer. They didn't want to live next door to free Black people. Isn't that terrible? So what Lincoln even flirted with in the moderates was colonization, colonizing the African Americans to Liberia, to the Caribbean, to South or Central America. They were trying all over the place. Crazy, huh? So at any rate, revisionist historians, what can they contend against Lincoln? Quotes challenging the rationale used to defend slavery? No, they wouldn't use that. That court historians would use that, right? Because that makes him look good. Remember where he states, if A can claim that he has the right to enslave B, then why is that? Oh, you say because A has lighter skin. Okay, well, take note then, A, you can become the slave to the next person you meet with lighter skin than your own. Remember that? So the revisionists wouldn't use that. B, the interpretation of Lincoln's concession to border states as a temporary chess move. No, because that is an excuse, right? You're given the benefit of the doubt to Abraham Lincoln. So again, revisionists wouldn't use that either. Because remember, he contended that he was only allowing Kansas, Missouri, Tennessee, the right to keep their slaves if they fought for the Union. But he contended to his secretary of, oh gosh, it was the one that was almost killed, not Stanton, oh, I'm sorry, it's evading me right now. It was part of the conspiracy to kill Lincoln and to kill 2 or 3 other people. But at any rate, he was an abolitionist in Lincoln's administration. And he was furious with Lincoln in offering this to the border states. And Lincoln contended, hey, this is just a chess move. I'm using them right now for their help. But when I no longer militarily need them, I'm going to make them get rid of their slaves as well. They just don't know it yet. So that was his chess analogy. So that would be used by court historians, given the benefit of the doubt to Lincoln that he had good intentions, but he was just very shrewd in his timing, and that only at the right time would he be able to show his true motives of wanting to free the slaves. What about C, Lincoln's quote against political and social equality between the two races? Absolutely, that would be used by revisionists. He contended, whoa, guys, I'm not that radical in wanting to free the slaves. I didn't say anything, he said, about the social and political equality between black and white Americans. He says, I, as much as any white man, am for the position of the white man being in the superior position. It's an ugly quote, but he arguably was saving his own skin during the debate, because Stephen Douglas was contending, calling him an inward lover, and contending that he wanted, the social integration of black and white people, like intermarriage and so forth. And Lincoln's generation was just not ready for that.
I have a question. Do you know about Lincoln having any like half black kids?
I do not. And that certainly doesn't mean that it's not true. I'm disappointed to admit that I have not come across that.
There's a whole like family of half of his kid,
Wow. Well, I assure you, you guys won't get to see it because we're at the end of this literally is our final Zoom for the semester. But I can guarantee you that I'm going to begin looking into that immediately.
Me too. I'm curious.
That has definitely piqued my interest immediately. But yeah, I'm very sorry. I've yet to come across that information. Very, very interesting. All right. And
because wouldn't they be like really tall? Wasn't he like close to over 6.5 foot tall, 7 foot? So
yeah,
like he was breeding with like even some of his slaves and had a couple of kids, they would be huge.
Yeah, but I mean, it had to have been a short window though, because his wife was a Kentucky slave owner from a father who was a Kentucky slave owner. But when they married, and especially when he became the president, he put enough pressure on his wife to free them. And so he wanted no part of that. He didn't want to be stained with that. And so I'm not saying it couldn't have happened. I'm just saying there was definitely a finite window from which he could have even been able to do that.
Anyways, I have so many questions. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. I like that. That's okay. But yeah, I'm sorry to say that it won't be pertinent to our class because of its ending, but I will definitely look into that. That's an intriguing question. And so Lincoln's opposition to options for the establishment of slavery in the Western territories, that is true, right? But remember, that was moderate. So revisionists really wouldn't feel like that's a juicy detail. And then Lincoln's support of the 13th Amendment, again, court historians would support that because that makes him look good, that he was for the end of slavery. But that quote on the social and political equality of the two races, that definitely would be utilized by revisionist historians. All right. Then getting into polarizing events at this time period, included chaotic and confrontational consequences to political solutions. So like the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, allowing the legislators of Kansas, Nebraska to choose for themselves if they want slavery. Both those legislative solutions ended in violence. So those definitely were some polarizing events in the 1850s. The Underground Railroad and the fear of fomenting a slave insurrection. Remember I mentioned the Secret Six, that they contended of secretly 6 senators who were supposedly paying for and subsidizing and supporting Harriet Tubman. So all that definitely would constitute a polarizing event of the 1850s. A bold attempt by the Supreme Court to secure the enslavement and disenfranchisement of Black men, the Dred Scott case, absolutely. So all those are true. And so revisionist history, right? Revisionist history contends that this was not a moral crusade to end slavery, right? And that it was about states' rights. It was about who was going to control the West and whose image the West would be made in these new Western territories / states. It was about keeping the Union together and not allowing the 11 and a half Southern states, I say a half because Missouri, the 11 and a half Southern states from leaving. And that it only gradually began to artificially become about slavery when it became convenient. When the North needed a cause after they were losing so many men, especially like the Gettysburg Address, right? When the North became exceedingly desperate to win and in need of Black soldiers to help win. That only then did the federal government and the Republican Party begin making this war to be about slavery. That's revisionist history. That's number 2 on that handout, right? So includes evidence of racism and discrimination in the North as well as in the South? Absolutely. Revisionist history. Declarations by President Lincoln and Congress that combating slavery was not their primary concern? Absolutely. Written evidence that key political leaders stressed the need for African American men's military help. So hence desperation and ulterior motive to setting them free and drafting them. Absolutely all the above for revisionist history. Revisionist data on Lincoln includes everything but his Declaration of Emancipation only for slaves of rebels. That is true. An infamous quote against the social and political equality of Black and white Americans. We've already talked about that, yes. Evidence that he dragged his feet in confronting slavery in the states where it had already been sanctioned. Absolutely. His refusal to place any radical Republicans in his cabinet. That is false. Okay, so because we're on test 3, because we're at the end of the semester, because we're already a week past your due date for, well, not a week, but a few days past your due date for the quizzes, I'm assuming you have your textbooks now. So I promise I'm not picking on you, but I can't recall the last time I have. On test 3, I never go over the textbook questions. I want you to do them, okay? But take a look at them. The textbook contends that the Free Soil Party's formation signaled the inability of existing parties to contain the political passions created by the slavery issue. Go to the index, look up Free Soil Party. It'll give you page numbers. You could find it. Antietam, same thing, according to the text, hosted the war's bloodiest day of battle. That should be easy to confirm or refute. The textbook contends that Union leader George B. McClellan's tenacity and willingness to sacrifice soldiers helped defeat the Confederacy of the South. I already argued against that in our last Zoom meeting. As you'll see, the textbook will too. Brinkley's test and class lecture stressed Northern economic and naval superiority, as well as higher morale and superior generals. So all those need to be true for that to be true. Check that out on chapter 14. At the end of the war, Grant's army deprived Richmond of resources and trapped Lee's mobile army, and Sherman helped break the proverbial will of the South with his destruction of Atlanta and march through South Carolina. And that's the ending of the war that you'll find at the end of chapter 14. See if that's true or not. Okay. All right, you guys. So that's it. I've enjoyed having you. I hope you guys are doing well. Hope you do well on this final. I'll have your final grades computed within about 3 days of the final day of the semester, which is the 14th, which is a Saturday night. So I should have those done Monday or Tuesday, no later than Tuesday. And I'm happy to give you your extra credit points for today.
Hey,
Thank you, Professor.
yeah, totally.
Thank you. Thank you. I've enjoyed having you. I hope you guys do well, everything that you do.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to see you.
Nice.
All right.
And a side note, Abraham Lincoln had 3 kids and most of them died or didn't make it to like 18. So
Yeah.
it seems like I don't know. Yeah, I want to check that out. Maybe I'll email you later if I get any info on that or find it.
I would
If you
love
find
that.
the book, send it to me, okay?
Got it.
Thanks for everything.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you. All right. That goes to everybody. All right. So there are any last minute questions or comments before I bid you adieu for the last time? Thank you, Susanna. I appreciate that. I hope you're all doing well. I wish you the best in everything in life. I know that sounds trite, but I mean it. All right. So take care, okay?